Often described as the bloodiest war to take place on American soil, at the cost of over 600,000 lives, more than the combined American deaths in the First and Second World Wars. The Civil War was a key event in America's history, and its outcome would help determine the type of political entity the United States would be as it sought to exert its might and power on the world stage. The significance of the loss of life and sheer devastation wreaked by this war is something most of us can agree on. However, a century and a half later, disagreements linger and persist as to the real motivations for the Southern states' decision to secede from the United States and fight. In today's video, we will explore the most commonly cited reasons for the Civil War, as well as outline what makes this topic so controversial, especially given the context of today's culture wars. But let's start with a bit of history as to how the war began. For decades, tensions had been brewing between the northern and southern states. The northern states, which relied on small-scale farming and manufacturing, embraced abolitionism. On the other hand, the South relied on the plantation system, in which African American slaves contributed to a bulk of the labor, despite making up a smaller percentage of the population. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln, leader of the anti-slavery Republican Party, won the presidential election against the Democratic Party split into northern and southern factions. By the following year, as Lincoln took office, 11 southern states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America and led by the Democratic Senator of Mississippi, Jefferson Davis. Although intent on avoiding violent confrontation, Lincoln believed that America's prosperity was dependent on the preservation of the Union and so promised to protect federal properties in the South. One of such properties was Fort Sumter, a sea fort in South Carolina occupied by Union forces. On the 12th of April 1861, Confederate troops fired on the fort, marking the start of the Civil War. The first explanation often given for the origins of the American Civil War is that it was a conflict over the issue of slavery. Before the war began, attempts to resolve the issue amicably had been unsuccessful. For example, the Missouri Compromise was passed in 1820 to allow the admission of Missouri into the Union as a slave state. The Union at the time constituted 11 free states, making up the North, and 11 slave states in the South. The addition of Missouri would throw off the balance, making it 12 slave states and 11 free states. To keep Congress in balance, a compromise was made. Missouri would be admitted to the Union as a slave state, and the new free territory of Maine, which was previously part of Massachusetts, would also constitute a part of the Union. In addition, slavery was prohibited in parts of territory acquired in the Louisiana Purchase north of the 3630 parallel. The outcome of this was that the expansion of slavery was limited. However, slavery remained in the South. When the Civil War began a few decades later, North and South would be split along this very same parallel. The compromise would be controversial in that as much as it prevented armed conflict between the North and South in the 1820s, in an attempt by both sides to retain political power over future territories, it expanded slavery into new territories and emphasized the division between both sides, divisions that would lay the foundations of the Civil War. Many historians say the compromise helped postpone the war, and they wouldn't be wrong in saying so. Writing in 1820 from Monticello to one of the architects of the compromise, John Holmes, Thomas Jefferson described the compromise as a fire bell in the night, and described the parallel as coinciding with a marked principle, moral and political, once conceived and held up to the angry passions of men, will never be obliterated, and every new irritation will mark it deeper and deeper. The Missouri Compromise would hold until 1854, when the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, allowing for slavery north of the parallel. But more on that soon. The Compromise of 1850 was another attempt to settle issues regarding slavery between North and South. Proposed by Senator Henry Clay, its goal was to avert the dissolution of the Union. The issue at hand was regarding land recently acquired during the Mexican-American War. Would they be slave states or free states? In the end, the Compromise of 1850 would delay secession of the South by a further 10 years. 5 acts were enacted, resulting in 1. California becoming a free state, 2. Slave trading, but not slavery itself, being banned in Washington DC, 3. the borders of Texas would be established. 4. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which dealt with the issue of runaway slaves by making it a federal instead of a state responsibility. And the 5th Act gave way for the new territories of Utah and New Mexico to decide their stance on slavery. As with the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850 was also controversial in that as well as it provided a temporary solution, thus delaying armed conflict, it would entrench the divisions between anti-slavery and pro-slavery factions. This is best evidenced by a war known as Bleeding Kansas. Remember the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 I mentioned earlier? Well, as well as repealing the Missouri Compromise and creating Kansas and Nebraska, it instituted a policy known as popular sovereignty. This policy gave authority to citizens of a given territory to decide the legality of slavery for themselves. During Bleeding Kansas, individuals from both sides of the slavery debate would enter the territory to influence the outcome in Kansas in a series of violent guerrilla confrontations in Kansas from 1854 to 1859. And that brings me on to the second explanation often cited for the origin of the American Civil War, which is that the Civil War itself was a conflict over states' rights. That is, that states should decide for themselves if they wish to be slave states or free states. The first major battle of the war, the First Battle of Bull Run, ended in a decisive victory for the South, despite the North's access to better resources. Its result would prompt both sides to recruit more troops after they realized it would be a longer battle than expected. Over the next few years, the troops would be engaged in a series of battles resulting in thousands of casualties. On September 17, 1862, the bloodiest day of fighting would take place in the Battle of Antietam, resulting in 12,000 casualties on the Union side and 13,000 on the Confederates. The Union victory would allow Lincoln to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. On January 1, 1863, 4 million African slaves were declared free. By doing this, he not only made a giant step to end slavery in the United States, but inspired African Americans to join the Union Army in its fight, and dissuaded European powers from recognizing the Confederacy. By the end of the war, almost 200,000 black men had fought for the Union. The end of the war came on the 9th of April 1865, when an army led by Robert Lee surrendered to Ulysses Grant. The victory of the northern states resolved two key issues posed to the United States. Would this young republic be stable, or would it fall to revolts like happened in France? Also, would the land of liberty and freedom now extend those same values to the African American citizens? Lincoln himself would be assassinated 5 days after the surrender of the South by a Southern sympathizer who was vehemently against Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and had issues with the plans to give African American men the right to vote. As we all know, the legal declaration of the liberation of African Americans from slavery was not the end of their struggle for freedom. Well into the 20th century, and in many ways still today, African Americans would continue fighting for their rights. For example, in the immediate years after the Emancipation Proclamation, a period known as Reconstruction, during which the 15th Amendment would be passed, granting African American men the legal right to vote. However, they still were denied this right by states who circumvented the law with the use of poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation. The struggle for freedom would continue 95 years after the Emancipation Proclamation in the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century. Further amendments to the Constitution for voting rights for adults of all races and genders were secured through federal enforcement. And more recently, the Black Lives Matter movement, which is primarily concerned with the issue of police brutality and extrajudicial killings of black people. We will now explore the arguments for and against the two commonly used explanations for the origins of the American Civil War: slavery and Southern rights. It should come as no surprise what my stance on this debate is. The American Civil War was fundamentally a conflict over slavery. At the heart of the tensions between the opposing sides were disagreements over the institution of slavery. Be it states' rights, economic differences, cultural differences, these reasons are interconnected because of their link to slavery. In arguing that the South's secession was not due to slavery, the idea of the lost cause was used. It suggested that by seceding, the South was merely trying to protect its way of life and portrays those who fought for the Confederate States as heroes. By minimizing the role of slavery, the South would portray itself as fighting a noble cause as it romanticized its role in the bloodshed that was the American Civil War. Its advocates would go as far as venerating its generals by building statues, erecting monuments in their honor. However, this narrative becomes difficult to believe when you consider that many leaders of the Confederate States made clear their motivations before the Civil War. Texas delegates wrote that the abolition of slavery would bring inevitable calamities upon both races and desolation in the slave states. The Mississippi secession documents said that their position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. In Louisiana, I quote, "As a separate republic, Louisiana remembers too well the whisperings of European diplomacy for the abolition of slavery in the times of annexation not to be apprehensive of bolder demonstrations from the same quarter and the North in this country. The people of the slaveholding states are bound together by the same necessity and determination to preserve African slavery." The Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, himself said that slavery was the reason for secession in his cornerstone speech, and went as far as disagreeing with Thomas Jefferson's words in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, saying that they were wrong. He says, "Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition." The South not only wanted to continue slavery, but also had plans to spread it beyond the United States, including to Central America, in places like Cuba. By the end of the 19th century, the myth of the lost cause was taking shape, with officers of the Confederates such as Jefferson Davis beginning to argue that it was not about slavery, but states' rights. Organizations such as the United Daughters of the Confederates would also play an active role in propagating the myth. To conclude, considering what we've discussed so far, it's apparent that the lost cause, or states' rights, or any other reason given but slavery is secondary. Slavery was fundamental and the primary driver of the secession of the Southern states. Most historians now consider the lost cause a myth, one that was allowed in the immediate aftermath of the war to help maintain the newfound fragile peace. Given the polarized nature of today's political landscape, one can draw parallels between the divisions that existed back then and now. Given how unresolved tensions in the form of failed compromises led to the Civil War, it is worth highlighting the fragile nature of society. In the context of today's culture wars, let us remember harmony is a condition we continuously have to strive for.